Corporal Roger Skinner, United States Marine Corps, Korea, the Forgotten War. I had the great pleasure and opportunity of meeting and interviewing Roger in Mountain High, California, almost 20 years ago. It was March the 24th, 2006. I was there for about a week interviewing veterans in that area. And Roger came forth, wanted to tell his story about Korea. Folks, he fought at the Chosin Reservoir in Korea. And if you know your history, that's probably the coldest battle that the Americans have ever fought in. And it was just amazing. I'm going to share a little bit more about a book that was written about the Korean War here in a minute. But Roger served as a radio operator in Korea and tells a great story about the Inchon landing in June of 1950 into the Chosin Reservoir that fall and into the next winter. Just incredible. He said 40% of the casualties were because of the cold. I've interviewed many, many dozens of Korean War veterans that were at the Chosin Reservoir. Could write a book, probably should. Roger's featured in my film, Korea, the Forgotten War, by the way. And this tells a great story. Just an unsung hero, man. Just, you hear this guy, this is like what he went through and the battles he saw and the cold and the Chinese and everything else, the politics of the Korean War. But anyways, a book was written called The Coldest Winter. I want to share this book with you for a minute. David Halberstam wrote this book. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner for his book on Vietnam, The Best and the Brightest. And he wrote this book, and it was when he completed this book in 2007 in April, 5 days later he was killed in a car wreck. And his life was ended at the age of 73. So sad ending, great book, almost 700 pages, The Coldest Winter, and it really goes into depth. He interviewed hundreds of veterans like I've done, and he wrote this book and other books, but just a great journalist and an American writer. Just God bless you, David, for your work on the Korean War. Folks, he called it the dark corner of our history. And it's too bad that a war has to be called that. Some don't even call it a war. They call it a police action. But when they're shooting bullets at you, it's a war. I don't care where you are. So, but I want to thank Bobby Susenbach. Bobby is a supporter of my work. He sponsored Bill Mendler's story months ago, and he stepped forward and wanted to sponsor another story. So Bobby, I thank you. And I want to thank your wife, Melissa, and your kids, Ava and Katie, your two girls. I want to say hi to all of you. And you got a great dad there. Katie and Ava's grandfather, who was Bobby's dad, fought in Korea at the Chosin Reservoir with the United States Army, 7th Infantry Division, and he fought there. And I think he passed away about 5 years ago. So, but just military history in your family. God bless you, Bobby. And I want to thank you for helping me with my work and sponsoring another story. And I want to share something. Bobby has a heart for our young, and so do I. Our kids today, with his two girls. And I have gone into many schools across our country, have shared my work and brought veterans with me. We've honored them, we've cried, and we've saluted them. And I want to keep that going on. My radio station, Voices of History Radio, my hope is to get that into the hands of our young people, Bobby, because they have a living history in the palm of their hands. Download the app on the Google Play Store, and you can have free history right in the palm of your hands, kids. So something for parents and educators to take advantage of. But Bobby, I share that passion with you for our young, that burden, our heavy hearts for the young. They need to learn about our freedoms and why we're free today, like your father who fought in Korea. So my father served during the Korean War, also in the Army. So that's what I want to do, and that's half of why I do my work, folks, is to share it with our younger generation. So let's hope and pray that that will continue this year, 2025. I'll have opportunities to continue my work in our schools. I love going into the schools. Okay, I need to wrap this up. Thank you for watching and sharing these stories, folks, subscribing to this channel, getting on Voices of History Radio. Let's get that thing going. I'm going to keep it going, folks. It's free. It's on the internet. You go to larrycappetta.com and you can listen to the stories right there. So I want to thank those of you that are helping support my work. I can't do it without you. God bless you for it, and I appreciate you so much. So, all right, folks, let's sit back and listen to Roger Skinner's story. We haven't forgot you, Roger. We're going to honor you now, sir, and your service during the Korean War. Roger's still with us today, 95 years of age. So God bless you all. Thank you for watching. Tell me, you were at the 1st Marine Division?
Yes.
Okay, we're starting now. And what was your rank at that time?
Corporal.
Okay, and were you a rifleman?
No, I was a radio operator.
Okay, okay, great. And how old are you now, sir?
76.
Okay, you look good.
Yes.
You look great. I basically, Roger, would like to just take the next 40 minutes or so and just talk a little bit about the Chosin Reservoir. I know there were a lot of things that happened in Korea. My particular focus right now is what they call the frozen Chosin. And did you come in at Inchon?
Yes.
Okay, can you just kind of walk me through it just a little bit briefly and then lead me into how you came to...
Through Inchon? Or?
Well, just tell me briefly about the landing and coming into Korea, you know, as you came into Korea and then as it got later in 1950. And tell me how you got to be at the Chosin Reservoir, and then I've got specific questions I want to ask you about that. So, was this your first time in combat?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was a reservist, from the Alameda, if you know where that is. And we got called up on August the 15th, and we landed at Inchon on September the 15th. So there wasn't much time delay back in those days between the time our unit got activated and the time we were actually in combat. Today it's even faster, as you've probably seen from some of the guys that take an airplane over there and get back again.
Sure.
But that time we had to travel by ship. And I made the cutoff at each of the stages going over being the next age level allowed to continue on. You couldn't go overseas if you were under 18, but you could go overseas. So we got to Japan, and there at Japan they wanted you to be 18 and a half before you went into combat, so I was 18 and 3/4, so we got in there. So that's how I was put to each next stage. The reason I was a radio man, when I joined the Marine Corps Reserve, I was taking radio shop classes in high school, and so Alameda happened to have a communications company as a reserve outfit, so I joined that, and they made me a radio man right off the start, so we had some background in the field before we went into active duty.
Give me just a real quick synopsis of Korea. Why were you in Korea and who we were fighting in Korea?
I think the reason that our unit was in Korea is because they needed troops badly. The current Army troops were just falling apart. They couldn't sustain anything over there. They were being beat pretty badly. And I think the Marine Corps offered to send a unit over there. And so my involvement is because of that. They offered to do it, and they were able to gather, as I said, it did it fairly quickly, less than 30 days to get us over. They had to interview everybody, make sure they were qualified to go. A lot of them got left behind in the reserve that didn't have enough skill for what they wanted them to do. And so that got us over there. And it didn't take long after that to learn the ropes.
So you're over in Korea, you're far away from home, and start walking me in towards why did we call it the Chosin Reservoir? Was that an actual physical part of Korea, North Korea? Is that what that was?
Yes.
And were you chasing the North Koreans across the 38th parallel? Just tell me a little bit about how we got involved in the Chosin Reservoir.
I think generally MacArthur is credited with making the decision to advance beyond the 38th parallel once we'd made the Inchon landing and had defeated the troops there. The North Korean troops collapsed just about the same way we had at that time, and they had to retreat back into North Korea. So MacArthur said, go to the 38th, past the 38th parallel up to the Yalu River, which is the border between Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. And they didn't meet an awful lot of resistance on the way up. It wasn't until we hit the Chosin Reservoir, which is in a mountainous area in the northern part of Korea, along that borderline. It's a very difficult border, always has been. And it wasn't until we hit that spot that we ran into the Chinese armies. And I don't think MacArthur's staff realized that they were fully committed to being in the war. They hadn't been up until that time. There'd been no sign of them at all, and he thought he has an easy shot. So he said, everybody go on up. And it was more like a you'll be home by Christmas routine. Just go on up, occupy the place, and then we'll bring everybody home. And it didn't turn out that way. It did turn out that the Chinese were deeply involved in the thing. But they still didn't make their presence known. And they used the tactics of drawing the troops in until they were strung out in long lines, which, as you can see from that road map, there was just one road up into the area, so it was easy to get them strung out in small groups. And that's when they proceeded then to intercede at different segments along the line and break them up. They used the same tactics on both sides of the peninsula, one with the Army, and the Army broke up. They couldn't sustain it. I don't know what their reasons were in great detail, but they had a very difficult time coping with that. They don't have the small unit combat capability like the Marine Corps does. They're organized almost entirely different. They're for land warfare and large campaigns and so forth, where you can draw a line and everybody stands behind it on one side or the other. But the Marine Corps, having fought these island wars, was a lot more accustomed to small unit activities. They were based on the fire squad, fire team, which is only 3 men. And so you could control 3 men, but in the Army, the smallest unit was a squad, which is 12 men, and that's a lot harder to control under a difficult situation where you can't really see everybody. And I think that helped the Marine Corps survive. Plus, their officers knew that they had met some Chinese, and they discovered on the way up there that the North Korean units, while they may have retreated, didn't retreat as a crowd, they retreated as a unit. And so if you ran into one, you were going to run into trouble, and one of the small 1st Marine units did. And that's, I think, one of the things that said, hey, things are not as easy as they might seem. So by the time they got up the reservoir, they were keeping them in regimental groups. There were actually 3 of them, U.S.M.C, Coterie, and Hagaruri. But the Army units that were with us weren't organized that way. They weren't kept as a small fighting unit. They were just engineer units up and infantry units up. And they were at a little reservoir, I think it's called the Fuchun Reservoir, that's a little further to the north. And they essentially were massacred. There weren't many of them left. They had to walk out across the reservoir itself, which was frozen solid at the time of the Chosin campaign. And not many of them made it back. None of the commanding officers did. And the few people that did were those that didn't follow a standard route to get there. So that's roughly how they got caught up there and why it became such a ferocious campaign.
Well, obviously a lot of Marines were killed, wounded, froze to death up there. I mean, tell me how the weather had an effect on your campaign there. I mean, obviously.
Well, the first place, when you're in a combat zone like that, you're living outside. You don't live in a house and then go out to fight and then come back at night. And that alone was a major factor in how you were able to survive and not catch frostbite. And that wasn't an easy thing to do. A high percentage, I'd say 20%, but I don't remember what the exact number was. The books will tell you what that is. Succumbed to that and weren't able to withstand it, and they got evacuated for frostbite. You can't stay outside very long in doing it, and that the winds that would come down off that Siberian peninsula right straight into the Korean mountain mass and hit it really froze everything, including the weaponry. And most of the weapons we have didn't work. They'd freeze up. There was so tight tolerance that they'd just freeze up solid. So your M1s and your carbines just wouldn't work, and that was the main weapon everybody had. The Chinese, on the other hand, had some automatic weapons, small ones, but they weren't as made as with the same precision that ours were, so they didn't. They're very loose, and they'd still fire. So that's something you want to happen if you've got a weapon in cold weather. You want it to shoot. A number of them had some of the weapons we'd given the nationalist troops, Thompson submachine guns, and those work because they're a blowback operator. They don't require that small passage through a gas cylinder in the front of the rifle. So those would still work, but not much else would. Some of the big guns would, but everything was hampered by this. You had to keep it warm. The vehicles were the same way. You couldn't stop your engine in the evening and let it sit overnight, or it'd be frozen solid in the morning. So you had to keep the things running all night or have some way that you could start it again, because starters wouldn't work. The liquids would congeal, and all the others would have the same kind of problem. So they usually kept some of the bulldozers or tanks running most of the time. Fortunately, they had enough fuel that they could do that, and that allowed them to function for the time they were there.
Roger, tell me a little bit about the type of combat that you encountered at the Chosin Reservoir.
I was probably one of the most protected men in the whole thing. As a radio man, we were supposed to relay messages from the forward observers back to the weapons, and then they'd fire their missions. We'd tell them both ways that they were coming and going. So we traveled in my small group. We were attached to the 1st Marine Regiment headquarters. So wherever that headquarters went, we went as part of it. So we're always in the center of this thing. So we weren't assigned a combat position out where we were the front line trying to prevent any other troops from getting in. So we were in a very safe position. I didn't know all this when I started it, but it turned out that we were lucky enough to be that. So we actually didn't engage in combat itself as where I had to get up and shoot somebody or do anything like that. We were simply a participant in a very safe position.
Well, what about just the Marines in general? Was it small arms, artillery, hand-to-hand? I mean, what kind of combat were they facing?
Most of it was small arms, but we were very fortunate to have two kinds of support. The Marine Corps prides itself on its ability to have its own private Air Force support it. So those fighter aircraft are accustomed to going in and directing their fire wherever they're told it's needed. The Army has to depend on the Air Force to support them, and they have to make arrangements ahead of time for all this sort of thing. But in the Marine Corps, they're used to a much quicker response, which is necessary. If you want somebody, you want them now. An hour or two later, it's probably too late. You're either not there or the situation's changed. So they had these fighter aircraft on call, and they were able to use them. And they used both napalm and some bombs, and mostly just the machine guns that are mounted in the aircraft to help. The artillery was still functioning. They were still firing fire missions, but they were firing them a lot closer than they usually did, or a lot further, depending upon where you were between the 2 or 3 little entities that were out there, 3 little enclaves.
So were we trying to push the Chinese back, or were they attacking at night? Or I mean, what was the strategy? Were we trying to push them back and somewhere farther north, or just kill them all there? Or what were we trying to do?
At the start, we weren't trying to push them back as much because we didn't know they were there. After the fighting really got hot, it was more a question of surviving than anything else. There was no question of trying to go and gain ground. It was just lasting throughout the night to make sure you weren't one of those casualties that got carried off. Most of the infantry was involved in that kind of an effort, as well as everybody else who had fire missions or illuminating shells or whatever else they needed to see what was going on at night. The Chinese had no artillery support to speak of, because everything they brought in they had to carry in on the backs of somebody. So their supply system was one of their weak spots. So they couldn't bring in any heavy weapons. As you saw, there's no roads, and as long as you don't have any roads, you can't travel. And the Air Force itself helped to keep any road or rail traffic to a bare minimum, especially during the day. So any of that kind of traffic had to move at night, and that's essentially what they did. And that helped disguise what they were doing as well, because it took a while for MacArthur's intelligence to discover that what was going on and what they were really facing. So as I say, the start of the campaign and most of the Chosin Reservoir was simply a matter of surviving. It was questionable once we were up there and the Chinese had blown that water viaduct that came down through the pipes. There was no way out of there that we could think of. And I can remember hearing the discussions about whether or not there was one other road that went to the coast, but it wasn't passable for vehicles or tanks especially. So it would have been a walkout campaign if we'd gone that way. We didn't know that there were any Chinese out there, but we didn't think so. Fortunately, as it turns out, one of the surviving Army units was an engineer group that was skilled in building bridges. So they airdropped a bridge segment for the first time. In fact, they dropped about 8 segments to make sure they got the ones they needed. And the engineering group took that down to this blown out section and was able to span it, and that allowed the Marine Corps to take all its vehicles and its people out through that one road. The road itself, it's very steep on the upside and very steep on the downside, so in addition to that, one of the Marine units had to go up and clear the top of the hillside so that you couldn't just roll rocks on the people as well as shoot at them. And that was one of the other keys that allowed them to come down through that road. There was no worry about the bottom side because there was not much anybody down there could do. I can recall seeing a small light, I think they called them L5s at the time, flying along that valley alongside the road going out as we were walking out, and it hit one of the power lines that went across it. Its wing caught it. So of course it broke it, but it took the aircraft down, and we watched it hit right into the hillside opposite us, not on our side. So we couldn't even get to it unless we went all the way down the hill and all the way back up again, which would have been a difficult thing to do.
Were you guys greatly outnumbered by the Chinese?
Yes. The Chinese, knowing that they would not have the normal support that a full army would, did supply enough manpower. Odds were about 10 to 1 roughly. I think they had 60,000 or so to our 12,000 or so people that were involved in it. So each one of the times they tried this, and that was one of the difficult lessons I think they had to learn, was that having a superior number didn't necessarily mean you were going to survive.
Were they veteran or elite troops, Roger? I mean, I heard that, you know, they weren't, and they had guys there and they didn't have enough weapons, and they knew some of them would be killed, and they would pick up the weapons of the dead and continue on. Is that kind of how it was? Or, I mean, were they elite veteran combat troops, or do you know?
I think they were mixed. I think they were both. They'd been fighting since 1939 in the Chinese army for both the nationalist and the communist side. They'd been in a battle for a long time, many, many years. So some of those guys were seasoned veterans, especially the officers. And those were the ones that became most upset at being required to go into combat as they did without the normal support and logistics support that you'd expect of a field army. And a number of them I've read complained directly to Chairman Mao that that was absolutely the wrong way to do things, and he needed to do something different if he was going to continue on with this kind of effort. They got extremely upset with him at that, because none of the stuff they'd been promised was delivered. So they had a very difficult time of it, as well as us, in trying to get support up. But fortunately, we had an Air Force that could supply things by airdrop, which they didn't. So we managed to get supplied. So most of their troops had had some kind of combat before that. They just finished fighting the nationalists, and some of the groups were nationalist groups just incorporated into the Chinese army. But it didn't make a difference. They'd still been fighting the other side, which now was their side. So it worked both ways. But they did have some untrained people as well. But I don't think most of them were untrained in that sense. Most of them had been in the military because that was what they'd been in for a number of years. There were no fresh troops. They didn't call up any reserves, not at that time anyway.
What was the time span of the Chosin Reservoir? The month? I know it was 1950. How long did it last? Or
about a month is all. 30 days is all it took. I think we went up there about November the 27th and came back down December the 12th or 13th, so it's even less than a month. Probably only a matter of weeks. Didn't take long for it to gel and be completed.
tell me a little bit about the casualties that we sustained. I mean, were they a great number of them?
Yes, both because of gunshot wounds and because of the frostbite. Those are the two major factors, and I don't know that they were unequal either. Of the thousands of casualties that came out, at least 40% of them were due to the cold. They'd had some member of their body frozen to the point where they had to be evacuated. They could no longer function. And there again, the Marine Corps generals, O.P. Smith in particular, had really made sure that his engineers built 2 runways for aircraft at 2 of the 3 spots that we were surrounded in. And that allowed the transports to come in, the little old DC-3s would come in, drop a load of supplies, and then take a loaded wounded and leave. So they were able to get all their wounded out of there before, at each stage of it, those that had been wounded between U.S.M.C and Hagaru, and then between Hagaru and Coterie were allowed to get evacuated. So the people who left, most of them were what you might call a walking wounded if they were in shape enough to walk.
So it wasn't like in Vietnam where they brought in the Huey helicopters to medevac them out. You guys got on the old
No.
DC-3s and
Right. There were
none
of the military had helicopters at the time. There was one in the division, and that was the property of the division commander. And he used it, and I think he realized then that the helicopter was a wonderful thing to have at your disposal. And so after that, later on in Korea, they started getting more and more of them in there. And that usage became much more common.
Were any of your friends killed or wounded in Korea? I mean, at Chosin Reservoir, people that you knew?
One of them was, and he's left in that unmarked gravesite at Coterie. But he was the only one that I know of that was. That's why I say I was in one of the safe spots, so most of the people immediately around me, who I just learned or just became acquainted with a few months before on the ship going over there. So most of them were strangers, except for the small group that came from that signal company in Alameda.
Does anything ever remind you of the cold? I mean, I can't imagine being outdoors one day, let alone a month. I mean, do things today, or do you like the cold now? I mean, does it bother you, or when it gets cold, or?
Most of the people that were involved in that campaign have developed what you would call cold injuries of some kind, and a lot of them are delayed because if you didn't get it in a severe case, you might have gotten a mild case, which simply made your circulation more difficult as you grow older. So a lot of the older veterans have what you might call residual cold injuries from that time that didn't hospitalize them then, but they do now. So there's some residual effects to living in the cold. Again, I've been fairly fortunate that it hasn't shown up in a serious effect yet, but I'm not old enough as most of the others, because I was one of the younger ones. I'll be the last one to get it, hopefully. But the rest of them, I've seen a number of them have problems because of that. And some of them have died because of it.
I know one man told me he still sleeps with socks on at night because
Yes.
his feet were frostbitten in Korea.
Yes.
You know, can you tell me anything about Tootsie Rolls in Korea? The Chosin frozen Chosin?
You've heard about them, huh? Well, in the military, one of the pieces of ammunition is mortar rounds, and they come packaged in a long package that looks like a huge Tootsie Roll. And when the mortar guys ran out of ammo, they hollered for the guys, "I need some supplies," and they said, "Send more Tootsie Rolls," which is just a slang expression. And so the Air Force did, only they took it literally. They didn't know what a mortar round looked like, so they sent them a whole bunch of Tootsie Rolls. And unfortunately, they darn things you could eat. Eating was another problem in the cold weather. There was no way you could stop and cook something, because most of the rations came that you had to heat up some way or another. So you tended to eat only those things that were edible, and it's like opening a package of frozen fruit. You can't really eat it. So the things they ate were things like the cookies and the candy that came in a big block in the C rations, because that's about the only thing that you could digest. The rest of it you couldn't. And the Tootsie Rolls were in that category, so they came in handy in that respect. It's kind of a common joke, I guess. amongst most of them.
Well, have you ever gone to any of the reunions? I mean, I hear
No.
at the reunions they hand out Tootsie Rolls and all. You never
I
gone
think
to any
no.
reunions? Or do you belong to the Chosin few?
Yes,
Okay, is that a meeting? Is that a group that meets nationally, regionally? How does that work?
both. It meets nationally and has had, I think, reunions. Occasionally, there's another one due this year.
Okay, because I'd like to go to one in I think there's one in Las Vegas.
I think
coming up in
that's for the next
September.
one. Yes.
Is that the national one?
Yes.
Are you going to be part of that?
No,
No. Okay.
no. We haven't traveled to the reunions.
Okay, because that's something that I think I'd like to try to go to.
It's probably be a good spot.
Yeah. In fact, I've contacted Tootsie Roll too, just to see if their thoughts, because they are well aware of what you guys did. But that's a great human interest story.
It probably is.
You know, people don't know much about that. But anyways, I'm intrigued listening to you now. As a radio man, did you work? Who was your commander on the battlefield? Was there a sergeant, a lieutenant in charge? I mean, who were you with, or you just at a communication station, or?
For my own personal involvement, we were part of a group of 24 that was assigned to the regimental headquarters. We had both wiremen in there, half were wire and half were radio. The wiremen would lay the lines to the different units back at the artillery section that needed to get the messages. But those often were either, because they moved around a lot, were often either blown out or never were there until later on. So the radio was used extensively. And one of the weakest points in the radios were the fact that they are all battery operated, and batteries don't do well in cold weather. So that became another weak spot for us. It was hard to communicate these requirements for things.
Was there protocol on the radio like there is today? I mean, do you remember how you would initiate a conversation, or were there code words? How would you talk to somebody? You wouldn't say, "Hey Joe, how you doing?" I mean, were there code names, colors? I mean,
yeah, every unit had its own individual designation, as did ours, and you'd simply have to get on the radio. We'd set it up at the start usually during the morning, and make sure that everybody was online. You have to make contact with your forward observers up front, and make contact back with the units, the artillery units themselves at the back. Usually we contacted the Fire Direction Center, which is the area where they'd assign whatever particular guns they wanted to go fire the mission wherever it was. And what we would do is pick up a message from the forward guys and relay it word for word to the Fire Direction Center so that they'd know where to shoot. And it was simply a matter of, once you've established contact, you listen for a message. When it comes in, you write it down and you repeat it, send it back. And then the Fire Direction Center will tell you when they're going to shoot so that you know to look out for it. And then there was a lot of adjustment often to tell you, okay, you need to come up 50 yards or go 50 yards left or right or something like that. And so there was a shorthand way of just saying one round on the way, or to tell them that they were going to fire for effect, which meant all the fire they was going to get was going to come all at once. But that usually didn't happen until after they zeroed in on where they thought they were supposed to be. Usually took 1 or 2 rounds to do that.
I've talked to a lot of World War II guys, over 200 of them, and sometimes I'll ask the question, what's the sound of combat sound like? I mean, was there continuous fire? Were there explosions? Did you just get so used to it didn't bother you? I mean, what were you hearing where you were at? Was it?
I don't think you ever get used to it, but I'm not sure that most people who haven't been through it recognize that combat usually only lasts a very short period of time. The rest of it just sitting and waiting. And you never know when the combat's going to come most of the time. It's initiated by one side or the other, so that other side knows when it's going to happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the other side knows. In our case, you just have to wait. Are they coming now? No. Well, okay. When they start shooting, then you know it started. But ordinarily, they don't last long. 20 minutes would be a long time.
You remember hearing bugles or whistles when the Chinese would come?
Yes, yes.
Was that frightening at all, or?
No, it was a nice warning that things are about to start, so you get very nervous, and then you have to make sure that everything you need is right there where you want it, so that you can do it, whatever your job is.
You personally, again, though, I mean, were you sleeping outside with everybody else?
No, again, I was very fortunate.
Okay.
Where we were in the center of the headquarters unit, and we had a tent. So we were usually in the tent at night, which was a huge advantage in that cold weather.
Were you around any of the casualties? I mean, directly, indirectly? Could you help anybody, or how did that
No,
play out?
that was the medical unit that took care of them. And they had a tent down there, a large one, where they processed most of the...
So you had Navy corpsmen that were
Yes.
working?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and they did all that.
You think about Korea at all 55 years later? I mean, does it have any significance in your life anymore? I mean, what does Korea mean to you today?
I don't know that it means any more now than it did then, but it doesn't seem... The scenes you see on the news today don't seem much different. It's the same kind of situation. You can't tell the good guys from the bad guys most of the time. And you really have to be very careful of what you're doing and where you're doing it, and be very alert. It was no different now, or it wasn't any different then than it is now, that I can see anyway.
Was there a difference between the fighting in World War II and then the fighting in Korea? Can you see a difference?
Well, I wasn't a real World War II veteran, but no, most of the equipment and the personnel, most of the equipment was World War II equipment. There was nothing new that was generated during the Korean War, at least at the start of it when I was there. So it was all the same old gear.
What about just the way we fought? I mean, in World War II, you knew your enemy. I mean, lines were drawn, and well, you think Korea was like a prelude to Vietnam and everything that happened there? It seemed like there was a different. It seemed like a lot of people went to Korea with a World War II mentality, and then it was a different kind of fighting over there.
I don't think it was different. I think most of the people that went were not prepared for it. Most of the occupation troops were skilled at occupation, which meant you looked sharp and were dressed well, but you weren't that adept at combat, especially the Army units. And the Marine Corps, it's a bit different, as I say, because they tend to operate in smaller units. So they were a little better prepared and did better militarily, I think, for quite a while. And until the Army finally was able to stabilize itself and develop its own command systems that didn't fall apart. But I don't think it was any different than World War II. I think it was pretty much the same. It wasn't different enough. The difference was that this was all of a sudden. It would be like going back to 1939, 1941 for the U.S., and how prepared were they to do anything? Fortunately, they didn't have to do anything right at the start. The campaign was fought, wasn't really fought for quite a while. After the Pearl Harbor attack, there was some local problems there in Hawaii, but there was no land campaign at the time. There was time for the military to do things. And that diminished in Korea. You had to do something, and you had to do it fast. In Vietnam, it was even more so. And today, it's even worse. That the speed at which you have to be able to respond has shortened considerably, and it makes military operations extremely difficult. So you really have to have a trained force available, and you don't necessarily need a large standing army per se, but you need to have a reserve unit that you can call on to do things. And hopefully they're learning their lesson that the reservists get enough training before they go into a situation. But I think most of them are different enough that you have to adapt to them as they come up. But they're not that different from the last time, and that you're using totally different techniques. They have changed between the three wars, obviously. The weaponry is different, the communications are different. Now you see almost everybody with a headset to yik-yak with everybody else. But that creates its own problems.
Roger, as a veteran of Korea and an American citizen, what does freedom mean to you?
Well, it's obvious when you see some of the problems that other countries are having. China is a good example. Even the operation of a company is different, has to be different in China. They have different rules, so even the big guys have to turn around and respond to that, to their set of rules. And you can see that in this country they have a lot of freedoms to do things. It's unfortunate that you also have the freedom not to do a lot of things, and that can lead you into trouble too. You really have to have a good number of people that think that they have to have some of this military training before they need to have it. Because if you wait until the time you need it, it's too late.
What would you tell a young person today about the price for freedom?
Get your military training early, whichever way you want, whether it's in a reserve unit or a college unit like the ROTC. But get that out of the way first, because then you'll be much better equipped when the time comes. You'll be able to do something effectively and not have to wait for a long training period.
What does the American flag mean to you as a veteran? What does it represent?
Well, it's a representative of all the things I think in this country that you kind of take for granted because you're born here. And it isn't until you've gone elsewhere you find out that not everyone else has that same advantage. You can look at some of the other areas of the world. China is one of the examples. Nepal's another one, a little tiny country, but it's still undergoing a lot of turmoil, conflicts between a communist-leaning group and a royalty-leaning group and a center group in between them, and they're all trying to figure out how to function. And it's not going easily. It's not an easy thing. It's much easier to keep it going once you got it. But most people don't realize that until they've been through the other situations and understand that control is something that's easily lost.
What was the hardest part of the Chosin Reservoir campaign for you? I mean, was there a more difficult thing that you saw you had to do? What was the hardest thing for you in that campaign?
I think just trying to figure out how we were going to survive was the difficult thing. My choices weren't as difficult as a lot of others, so I had a fairly good time of it in that sense. We had enough supplies to survive. We didn't have to worry about survival as some of the guys did who were sitting out there right on the front line, so we did everything we could to make sure that they had what they needed. We weren't in the same situation, so we didn't have as difficult a time as it could have been.
Did you ever have the thought of, what am I doing here? Why are we over here? Have thoughts like that back then? Or?
No, I don't recall them, mainly because I grew up during the Second World War, so you became accustomed to battles and conflicts between nations, and so you kind of expected, yeah, we're going to have another one. This isn't going to go away like they thought during the last time. So I better get prepared for it now when it does come. So we kind of expected it, not knowing when or where. It just that you kind of thought ahead a bit and said, yeah, something like that is going to happen again.
Why do they call Korea the Forgotten War? Is there a reason for that?
I think because most of the people that fought it came back and nobody wanted to talk about it, so there was no discussions. You just went back to work and that was it. You went on your way, and it wasn't, there wasn't as big a deal made out of it as happened during the Second World War. In fact, I think the other facet would come up and say, hey, we don't want to go to war anymore, and that I think came to real fruition during the Vietnam War, where there was an extremely anti-war message that a lot of people were trying to develop.
You think it's important that we remember what happened in Korea, and why?
It probably is, because if it gets only the message over that these conflicts do happen and you need to develop the skills to avoid them or overcome them, whichever way it turns out. And that isn't going to go away no matter how long in the future you want to look, at least not as far as we can see. So you need to really prepare yourself for it ahead of time.
Were the North Koreans involved in the fighting at one point? Because I know the Chinese came into it, but were you fighting the North Koreans too, or not?
There was a North Korean unit that we fought that had remained intact, a small one, and they were extremely well-prepared troops and well-trained, well-disciplined, and very difficult to deal with. Most of the brutality as such came from units in North Korea, not from the Chinese per se. They didn't follow the same kind of patterns as, and they're doing the same thing today. They're very belligerent. They seem to feel that's their way of life, and they've adopted it. Even the Chinese have mellowed to a great extent that they don't do the same kinds of things.
Why did we get involved in the Korean War? I mean, what was going on over there that caused us to get involved?
I think it was a fallout from the Second World War where nobody heard of it or cared about it, and they arbitrarily drew this line between the northern and the southern parts. And then the Russians occupied the northern part and the U.S. the southern part. Korea had been occupied since 1906, I think it was, roughly, 1905, 1906, when the Japanese took it over. So they were tired of occupation, I think, about that time. They just took two different government approaches to how to cope with modern life. And that eventually led to more conflict between the two. And I think our own government thought that we ought to draw the line up there at the 38th parallel. We'd agreed on that. And so it ought to be held. And because of that, I think Truman decided that he should get his UN support and go on from there.
What was the major threat that caused us to get involved? I mean, again.
I don't think anybody thought it was a threat as much as it was there's a bunch of rowdies over there, let's go take care of it. They all thought it was going to be a very short-term thing. I don't think they realized how thoroughly the Northern Korean group had trained for combat, and how the U.S. Army especially had gotten to the point where it couldn't really do combat anymore. It wasn't ready for it. And because of those two misconceptions, I think they said, well, let's go. Let's go finish it off. Not unusual, I don't think.
Do you think the Chinese were prepared for the cold? I mean,
No.
were we prepared for the cold?
No.
Yeah.
No. We had to develop those kind of techniques. And the Marine Corps, I know, developed some cold weather training right after that because nobody was accustomed to it. The Chinese didn't do any better than we did. If you read some of their own books that were written about it, you'll find that it was as much of a problem, more of a problem for them than it was for us in a lot of ways.
Tell me just a little bit about the pride and the tradition and the camaraderie of the Marine Corps.
I think that, again, the Marine Corps have operated in smaller units, and they've tended to become more self-sufficient, and they know the people adjacent to them better than most units do. And so they're able to function as a unit. And being in the Marine Corps, they've developed a pride that says, we're going to do the best job we can that's possible to do, and they're not going to accept second best. And so that has helped them, I think, militarily, in that they fight better as a unit because they stick together more. They don't feel they're a member of a huge army. They're a member of a much smaller group that can cope with things better than most other groups can.
And every Marine's a rifleman?
Yeah, that training is essential, and the Army again discovered that fact late into the campaign. That if you train a guy as a cook, he can't really do much else than cook. But in the Marine Corps, as long as you have your basic infantry training, you may need it sooner or later. And the Chosin was one of those areas that really proved it, where everybody had to do everything.
Tell me a little bit about you being proud, or your pride of having served in the Marine Corps during Korea.
I was extremely glad to be accepted there because, again, in reading military history back before I ever joined them, you could see that the Marine Corps was a much better functioning unit militarily. It may not have been involved in huge battles like the Normandy invasion or European invasion. They had smaller campaigns, but they actually went about them more efficiently. And when you had people like MacArthur directing where you would go, MacArthur was I guess a genius is the best way to put it, a military genius in deciding how to fight battles and hitting people where they would least expect it and be able to do the most for what he had to work with. And when you take that into consideration in your military campaigns, you can do quite well, and I think he did in his battles across the Pacific. And the Marine Corps units that worked under that criteria, I think, showed that scheme worked fairly well.
Are you proud that you served our country?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I think everybody should. I think that they ought to extend military service to all the population, and not exclusively to those that are only the medically fit, so to speak. That I think there's a lot of places where disabled people could serve just as well, because not everybody who works in the supply division in the United States needs to have combat training as such, nor have those skills.
Do people thank you for what you've done?
Only recently, I'm surprised, and mostly from other veterans who were associated in a peripheral sense.
I'm going to ask you to do one more thing. I've asked everybody to do across the board if it's okay, and I understand the protocol of my request, but when I tell you, can you give me a salute into the camera?
I think so.
Okay.
I think we can.
Okay, sir, if you could just give me a salute into the camera.